In this makeup lecture, we're going to be looking at developments in Italian painting. In class, we had started to talk about how Italy was moving away from the International Gothic style in the 1420s at the same time that artists in Northern Europe were doing the same thing. But they are moving away from the International Gothic style in a different way, in particular in two major developments that we started to talk about in class. The first of these is human proportions, and the second is unified space, proportions in space. And both of these rely on an artist's application of logic to his art, a reliance on the mind rather than the senses. So in class we looked at how artists at this particular time were looking back at ancient sculpture. We see this quite clearly with Masaccio's figure on the far right, deriving his pose from the classical contrapposto, counterpoised balance of Greek art and its adoption by Roman art. This revived interest in ancient forms is part of this second phase of the Renaissance, whereas with Giotto and Duccio we only saw an interest in realism. But now we see artists turning to ancient Greece for inspiration on the human form. We also see that Masaccio is painting the same figure, the same pose, more or less, from two different angles. And that is suggesting that he's quite aware of the sculptural basis for this form and trying to paint as if he were a sculptor. This goes back to the old dialogue between painters and sculptors, a rivalry of sorts that's known in the Renaissance as the Paragone. The second way in which art moves out of the International Gothic style is through a unified space. So idealized figure based on classical Greek and Roman sculpture, and then a unified space based on using linear perspective or one-point perspective, a system that was only developed around 1420 by the architect Brunelleschi and then published in 1435, although artists knew about it in advance of its publication. And based on linear perspective, any parallel lines in a picture will converge at a single vanishing point on the horizon. And this is exactly the system that Masaccio uses in his picture, as we looked at in class. All of the lines from the building on the right converge at a single point, that point on the horizon line, which is the height of the tallest figure in the composition. And in this case, Masaccio arranges the vanishing point to be exactly the point where Christ is in the center to help focus our attention. As we look at the story that Masaccio illustrates for us, we see a scene from Matthew 17, the Gospel according to St. Matthew. This is a miraculous scene, but Masaccio tells it entirely through human interaction and gesture. Again, the humanism that we've read about that is so important for Renaissance art. So what we see here are three different scenes. This is the moment when the tax collector comes to Christ and his followers on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. So the man in red is asking Christ to please pay your taxes. And all of the apostles question whether or not this is legitimate to do. You'll notice, by the way, that they have halos that are also rendered in perspective. But as the money, the tax collector asks for money from Christ, Christ tells St. Peter that he can find the money if he goes over to the ocean, to the Sea of Galilee. He says, go there and you will find a fish. And so he's gesturing to Peter here. St. Peter wears this orange and blue, yellowish orange and blue, which is a costume he reappears in often. And he's saying, Christ is saying, through human gesture, go to the Sea of Galilee and tell me what you find. And Peter says, you mean over there? And he's pointing over to the right, where the Sea of Galilee is. And then in the background, we see him reaching into the mouth of the fish. He's taken off his yellowish orange tunic so that we just see the blue robe underneath. And again, his halo in perspective, almost like a pie plate that's been glued to the back of his head. And he's reaching into the mouth of the fish. It's a fairly complicated pose, and we can see that Masaccio is still somewhat struggling with the human figure on some levels. But again, this is really a difficult pose in the first place. And if you know the story from Matthew 17, what Peter finds is a coin in the mouth of the fish, and he brings it back to Christ, and he says, "Look what I found." And Christ says, "Whose picture is on the coin?" Peter says, "Why, it's Caesar." And then Christ says, "Well, then give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." And so, in a third scene from the same story, we see Peter now giving the coin that he's found miraculously in the mouth of the fish to the tax collector, who appears a second time. So in this one image, Peter appears 3 times and the tax collector twice, in order to tell the story through, again, a series of human interactions, even though it is a miracle. The miracle has been put somewhat in the background. Now again, this work is a fresco, which is common in Italian pictures from the Renaissance. It's from a family chapel, a private side chapel in one of the churches in Florence. And the family that paid for it was the Brancacci family. The family patriarch, who is memorialized by these frescoes, his name was Pietro Brancacci. He was dead by this point and buried here. But the frescoes are meant to commemorate him, and so they show in a series of scenes the Acts of the Apostles, and they focus quite prominently on St. Peter, his namesake. And so that accounts for some of the choices that Masaccio made in this particular illustration. Masaccio's breakthrough in applying this scheme of perspective and this interest in classical sculpture and the sort of solid three-dimensionality of his figures led the next generation of artists to follow in his footsteps. And from this next generation of artists, we see the artist Fra Angelico, also working in Florence, only about a decade after Masaccio's work. We see his same interest, I think, is pretty clear, in creating space through this new means of linear perspective. But at the same time, somewhat less of an interest in classical Roman body types. But as we look at the architecture in which the Annunciation takes place here, and we're very used to this scene by now, you can see that those tie rods that hold the arches together even sort of accentuate the perspective as it moves back into space. It's a unified space based on one point perspective. And what's interesting about this picture, I think, in many ways, is how the artist creates meaning. So we've seen a lot of these, and these are roughly the same time. They're within 5-10 years of each other. And this gives us a nice opportunity to talk about what's different about Italy versus Northern Europe. By comparison, Fra Angelico's image of the Annunciation is seemingly much more simple. She still hears the angel in a religious building, but it looks more like a convent, which is more proper for her than a simple church, or not a simple church, a very complex church in Van Eyck's image. But you'll notice that there's no decorations in Fra Angelico's image. There's no stuff. The story is told as a simple human interaction again, quite like Masaccio's tribute money. At the same time, the lack of details that might add to symbolism can themselves be seen as symbolic. So, for example, the empty room in which she sits, the empty space around her, can perhaps be seen as a metaphor for virginity. She sits in a clean room. Another well-known metaphor for the virginity of Mary is a walled garden, or a closed-off garden, full of flowers, but separated from the wild nature of the outside world. This is something that Fra Angelico includes in his work as well. We see the fence here, and the flowers on the inside, but the sort of more savage trees outside. Also notice behind her that there is the cell in which she prays. And in fact, the vanishing point, if we trace it from those tie rods holding together the columns, you can probably guess that it's the window behind her. And there's our age-old metaphor for the virgin birth, which is the light passing through glass and leaving it unbroken, passing into this very, very clean room. that is directly behind her. Our painter, Fra Angelico, was a Dominican monk. He belonged to the monastery of San Marco in Florence. He had taken vows to become a monk. The word fra means brother. And this was made for the monastery in which he actually lived. And it was placed at the top of the stairs, leading to the cells where each of the monks, Fra Angelico included, lived. And so you would come up from the public spaces down below, turn left, and there you would enter the space of all of the monks. And as we turn left, this is what we see, and you'll notice quite clearly that the architecture that Fra Angelico uses for his Annunciation, in fact, resembles quite closely the architecture of San Marco. It's as if the Annunciation is happening in the very space that the monks themselves inhabit. But it's important to remember that this was made for his home institution, the place where he lived and where he spent the rest of his life. Having such a talented painter on board, the monastery also used him for other major painting commissions. Fra Angelico also painted the high altar at San Marco, which shows the Virgin and Child on a throne surrounded by saints. That's a very old way of laying things out. We saw it going back to Duccio. On the right, in black, you can see, in fact, three figures here wearing black. They are Dominican saints, saints from the order that Fra Angelico was part of, who wore black and white as their costume. And kneeling in the foreground are two brothers who were saints from around the 4th century, Cosmas and Damian, who by legend were doctors, physicians in the Middle Ages. And this is St. Cosmas looking out at us. St. Damian, his brother on the right, is looking in toward the Virgin Mary. St. Cosmas has the face of Cosimo de' Medici, the leader of the famous banking family from Florence. In fact, he's here because it was Medici money that paid for the monastery and for all of its art. In return, what did Cosimo get? He got the monks to pray for him. He got a cell next to the monks for himself to pray as well. And it's important to remember that Medici, the name, comes from the Latin word for medicine. As you can see, it looks quite similar to the word medicine. Cosimo's name saint was Cosmas, and his brother's name was Damiano, Damian. And in fact, he had just died fairly recently, and so Saint Damian has his back to us, probably in reference to Cosmas, or Cosimo de' Medici's departed brother. Originally, this altarpiece had a predella at the bottom. We've seen predellas on a number of different occasions, and it was split up and sold sometime before the 20th century, and we're very fortunate in the National Gallery to have part of the predella from the San Marco altarpiece by Fra Angelico. So again, this is the altarpiece where he lived, this is the altarpiece where he spent his life, and we are now in proud possession of one part of that. The scenes across the bottom of the predella show 8 different scenes from the lives of Saints Cosmas and Damian. And their legend goes that they could miraculously heal people through the working of God. And because it was God, not them, who healed, they took a vow to each other to never receive payment for their services. So in the very first scene, we see the legend start off. Palladia is very sick. She's in the interior beneath the arch. And she's tried all sorts of different doctors, spent all of her money on different doctors. And so she comes to Cosmas and Damian finally, and they are able to miraculously heal her. I guess we could call this alternative health care if we wanted to. Notice in the interior the use of perspective, both for her bed and for the canopy above it, the curtains hanging around it, the solid figures with a good sense of anatomy kneeling on the side of the bed to heal her. She then insisted, we see Palladia twice, she then insists that Damien take a payment. And he refuses at first and keeps refusing, but then he finally takes the payment so as not to offend her. Sometimes that's the thing you've got to do. And it caused his brother Cosmus to get so mad that he demanded to never even be buried with his brother. He later forgave him, but this is sort of sets off the story. Damien receiving payment for something that they had done in the name of God. Now, this idea of receiving payment and having it be okay in the long run is very important for the Medici family, if you think about it, because they are, in fact, bankers by this point. The family had originally come from a family of physicians, but by the 15th century, the Medici family, the people who paid for this, the altarpiece dedicated to their name saints, were making money, receiving payments, in particular on loans they had given, which was itself problematic sin. So this sets in motion the story of Cosmus and Damien, and in a way that would have been particularly resonant to the Medici family. Also in the National Gallery is another painting by a monk, Fra Filippo Lippi. And he was very different from Fra Angelico. Fra Angelico is quite devout, but Fra Filippo Lippi turns out to have been relatively naughty, not particularly a good man to have become a monk. We have a biography of him. In fact, we have biographies of most artists written by a man named Vasari, V-A-S-A-R-I, written in the 16th century. Wrote a book called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. He gives us great backgrounds on all of these painters from the Renaissance. And he tells us that Fra Filippo Lippi, after having taken his vows, was on multiple occasions arrested for embezzling funds from various institutions. He also works, we're told by Vasari, he also works for Cosimo de' Medici. And Vasari tells us this wonderful story about how Cosimo had to lock him up in order to get him to finish any paintings. Otherwise, Fra Filippo Lippi would just go out and party. So he needed to be sort of on lockdown. Then Vasari goes on to tell us another story, is that he had gone to a different city outside of Florence to paint some frescoes. And while there, he falls in love with one of the nuns and gets her pregnant, at which point he's finally stripped of his vows. Works in the secular sphere, but he continued to call himself Fra Filippo Lippi, even after having lost really the legal right to do so. So in any event, regardless of his shady personal life, one of the things that Filippo Lippi focuses on throughout his career are these images of the Virgin Mary that are made for the open market, for private devotion. People would buy these for the houses, maybe for a chapel, but Filippo Lippi made multiple versions of these, with small details and small changes probably made at the client's request. And the details that are added, changed and altered in each one of these different Madonna and Child images, each of these adds up to a sort of nuanced meaning in one direction or another that would have been mediated between the painter and the artist, asking the artist, the client asking the artist to give me something that allows me to focus on this or on that. So let's look at some of these details and talk about their meaning. You'll notice that she sits in an apse, a little recess, a semicircular niche, and that the top of that niche, the half arch, is in fact in the shape of a conch shell. This is a symbol for the virginity of the Virgin Mary, and it comes through an analogy between the Virgin Mary and Venus. You'll notice that the headdress, for example, even looks like a pearl holding the headdress together, if we look here right? We can see that pearl. The idea of this association comes from the fact that Venus was also believed to have been born by the association of gods and the earth, and born miraculously from the sea, and floated to shore on a conch shell, very much like the one we see behind the Madonna and Child. And the idea of a woman of special stature, in Venus's case a goddess, being born miraculously without male intervention is something that also applies to ideas of not only the Virgin Mary but Christ himself. And each one of them, in their way, brings love to the earth. And it was actually quite common, as we'll see later in 15th century philosophy, to draw these kind of links between Roman mythology and Christianity. As we look at other details, you'll notice a close-up of Christ here, that Christ again grabs the Virgin's fingers, almost like he's tweaking it a little bit as well. This is something that we saw with Giotto's work all the way at the beginning of the 14th century, where it's this sort of tenderness between mother and child. But in this case, it's also her ring finger that he's grabbing. And this, again, adds meaning to the work. In theology, the Virgin Mary is associated with the Church. And the Church is often called the Bride of Christ. So theologically speaking, the Virgin Mary is both mother, physically, and theologically, the bride of Christ. Thus, when Christ becomes King of Heaven, she becomes the Queen. And so there's this idea that this might be some reference to a mystic or spiritual marriage of sorts between the two. Also notice in this detail where her hand is. She's got it, thumb and finger pinching the neck of Christ, and in fact touching him, sort of encircling his Adam's apple. Again, theology helps to explain this. Christ was seen as the new Adam, both of them through the intervention of God, miraculously born on the earth. Adam brought the downfall of man, where Christ brings the salvation of man. So throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, we see Christ called the new Adam, the Virgin Mary called the new Eve. Each of them brought to us to help solve the problems that that Adam and Eve brought to the earth. Finally, for this part of the makeup lecture, we'll look at one more image of the Madonna and Child, also made in Florence, for this burgeoning market for images for private use. In this case, the Madonna and Child are accompanied by two angels in a painting by Alessandro Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli was a pupil of Fra Filippo Lippi, and in fact, his image is based quite closely on an earlier image by Fra Filippo Lippi that he simply adapts from. This sort of copying was perfectly fine in the Renaissance, where sometimes copies were prized more than original works of art. In both of them, you can see that perspective still plays a role, much more subtly in the Lippi work on your left, but much more strongly in the interior that Sandro Botticelli has constructed, where it does in fact exist in measured and perfect one-point perspective. If we look really closely, we can see the incised lines into the ground on the panel where he's laid it all out. So we have this sort of quasi-purple interior she's seated in. Again, a conch shell over her head. Behind her, a wall, a reference to the walled garden of virginity, probably. She sits on a throne. The halos existing in perspective as well. This particular work, we know who commissioned it. She sits on a throne, excuse me, with these 6 balls in a shield on the throne. That is the coat of arms of the Medici family. And so they would have been, excuse me, they would have been the patrons who paid for this particular work. And as such, they get to have elements that refer to their status included within that work.